There's so much work that still needs to be done, so I'm disappointed that I won't be able to do that.
Vanessa Wilson says her firing was a political move, and she isn't the only one making that claim.
The city's action shows that restoring public trust is not a priority.
State GOP leaders back an election denier and a clerk accused of tampering with election equipment in major races.
I don't believe that the delegate base represents Republicans in Colorado as a whole.
And President Biden announces new measures to curb the rise in gun violence.
If you commit a crime with a ghost gun, expect federal prosecution.
They have been clearly angered by some of the decisions that I've made, and again, I have to do the job that the community has asked me to do and what city management had asked me to do.
Aurora's now former police chief, Vanessa Wilson, spoke publicly today for the first time since she was fired last week by the city manager. City manager Jim Twombly said his decision came down to concerns over department management. Wilson claims the timing was convenient and says there should not be partisan politics in public safety.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us for Denver 7 News at 5. I'm Ann Trujillo.
And I'm Shannon Ogden. Glad you're with us tonight. Denver 7 investigative reporter Jennifer Kowalewski was at that press conference Wilson held today, and Jen joins us live.
And Jen, former Chief Wilson says she is not ruling out a lawsuit.
Ann and Shannon, the former chief says she's exploring all options. She called her firing politically motivated. When Aurora city manager asked her for an exit strategy, Wilson says she refused to go quietly.
I wasn't going to accept a resignation and just walk away when I know what this is driven by. And this is a political agenda, and there should not be partisan politics in public safety.
Wilson is talking about the new city council she blames for pressuring the city manager to fire her. The city manager has stressed he wasn't influenced by those city leaders. Jim Twombly said it came down to a lack of leadership. Wilson's termination came days after Denver 7 Investigates first reported on a massive records backlog. More than 2,500 crimes stuck in a queue, delaying investigations. Wilson called that timing deliberate.
Obviously, it's something no one wants, no chief wants to have happen or have to be dealing with. But we have been dealing with this for years. This is not a revelation. This was for lack of a better term, a convenient moment for them to disparage me. And that is the bottom line.
More than a dozen community leaders stood and spoke in support of Wilson. They called her firing an injustice. They said the chief showed up when no one else would and helped bring community into policing. Again, city management has said there is more to leading a department than community outreach, and ultimately that is why she was fired. But Wilson disagreed with that today. Ann?
And I'm sure we'll be hearing more about this. Thank you so much, Jen. Now, as Jen mentioned, more than a dozen supporters of Chief Wilson were at today's rally. Many of them thanked her for leading the department during the Elijah McClain death investigation and for being transparent about disciplining officers. APD is now being led by Division Chief Christopher Jewell, and city leaders plan to name an interim chief in the coming weeks, and they're hoping to hire a permanent chief within the next 6 months. Police in Aurora responded to 2 shootings overnight that left 2 teenagers and 2 adults injured. Now, officers are still looking for the person who shot a teenage boy and a girl during a street race. Now, officers were initially called to Alameda and Peoria for reports of street racing and fireworks, and that is when they found the shooting victims. Both are expected to survive. Also overnight, a man and a woman were shot. This happened at an apartment near Colfax and Xanadu. The male victim is in critical condition, and officers did arrest a male suspect a few hours later.
A 6-year-old boy has died in Fort Collins. Police say he accidentally shot himself. Officers were called to a home off East Lincoln Avenue Sunday night where they found this boy with a gunshot wound. He was taken to the hospital where he died. Now, Fort Collins police chief said, quote, "Words cannot begin to express the depth of our condolences for this devastating loss of a young life." Chief says his department is actively investigating what led up to the shooting. Well, today President Biden announced new steps aimed at regulating so-called ghost guns. The president said the guns that can be bought online in separate parts and assembled at home and can easily then get into the hands of minors and others who are not authorized to have a gun.
Is it extreme to protect police officers? Extreme to protect our children? Extreme to keep guns out of the hands of people who couldn't even pass a background check?
The Biden administration will now require background checks for anyone who tries to buy a gun assembly kit. There will also be a requirement for each gun to have a serial number so they can be more easily traced by law enforcement if used in a crime. Now, Denver recently adopted a new law banning the use of these ghost guns in the city. If someone is found to have one, they could face up to 30 days in jail and a $1,000 fine.
Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky says more than 10,000 civilians have now died in the city of Mariupol since Russia's invasion began. The mayor of Mariupol says the actual death toll could be more than 20,000. Russia is now pushing ahead to its next target, the eastern part of the country. And the Pentagon says Ukraine still has a lot of air defense capability. And the U.S. Defense Secretary is working on sending long-range air defense systems to help bolster their troops.
One of the companies that lost the bid to clean up debris from the Marshall Fire says it will now drop its lawsuit against Boulder County if its selection process is reviewed in what it considers a fair manner. Florida-based Ceres Environmental Services, Inc. claims the company Boulder County chose, DRC Contracting, held secret negotiations with the county. Well, despite the lawsuit, Boulder County said last week it will move forward without changes to the current timeline unless a judge orders otherwise. Well, Republicans and Democrats held their statewide assemblies this weekend to pick who will be featured on the primary ballots.
On the Republican side, some controversial picks were made, and Denver 7 politics reporter Megan Lopez has more on how election deniers could now represent the GOP.
There's an interesting energy to state assemblies.
Red wave is about to hit Colorado.
Something about the crowds, the signs, the noise that get people excited about politics.
The intensity and the energy was really high down there.
With a big midterm election ahead at the Republican State Assembly, that excitement was palpable and the results unpredictable.
First off, there was a huge challenge to the method of voting.
Twice delegates tried to switch to paper ballots for the votes, and twice the efforts failed. The candidates that earned the top slot also a surprise. Fresh off her rally with MyPillow CEO Mike Lindell, Tina Peters, who's repeated many of the debunked election fraud conspiracies, had quite a showing, earning more than 60% of the vote for Secretary of State.
When Tina Peters stood up, she received standing ovation.
Republican State Representative Ron Hanks, who's also focused much of his campaign on election fraud, also won the top primary slot for U.S. Senate to take on Michael Bennet. So did Greg Lopez in the governor's race. He promised to pardon Peters if she's convicted and earned 34% of the vote.
Well, what we learned was that you need to fully embrace fringe election fraud conspiracy theories in order to certainly to access the top line of the ballot.
But Republicans George Brockler and Ryan Lynch say those candidates don't represent the party.
I think it's a small fraction that are willing to do anything to get into power, and I think it's appalling.
And they're worried these candidates will make the election all about 2020 and not about what's happening now in the state.
Fortunately, despite the outcome of the assembly this weekend, we have very good candidates still in the running.
After the votes were counted,
Votes did not count today.
gubernatorial candidate Danielle Neuschwanger confronted GOP leadership, alleging errors in the process. But Brockler and Lynch say they think Christy Burton Brown did a good job running the assembly. Now it's on to the primary, where all Republicans participate and so can unaffiliated voters after a judge on Friday dismissed a Republican-led lawsuit to keep them out.
I just think that the Republican Party will define itself by who it advances to the general election ballot.
Megan Lopez, Denver 7.
And as for Democrats, most of the candidates selected for the June 28th primary are incumbents like Representatives Joe Neguse, Jason Crow, Diana DeGette. There were some exceptions. State Senator Brittany Pedersen will be the nominee in the 7th Congressional District. It's been held by Representative Ed Perlmutter for the last 16 years, who announced this year that he would not run for re-election. State Representative Yadira Caraveo will be the candidate in the newly formed 8th Congressional District.
It was more of giving them an opportunity to learn how to move their body. They may never get this opportunity.
A Centennial Dojo brings new meaning to the phrase home studio.
So everybody can see me. Cool.
Well, those winds are whipping again, and they're going to whip up snow for the mountains and some rain and snow for Denver.
And the Broncos are getting back to work in the offseason.
So ready to get started.